everyone. So, welcome to week two, and hope you're getting your feet wet and getting comfortable with the class. I hope you're finding some things that challenge you or help you sort of rethink maybe how you thought about the idea of politics and what politics is, what it's not, and how it pertains to your everyday life. That was the essence of week one, was to try to help build a foundation. And of course, this is a learning process, so I don't expect you to sort of like take it all in and sort of memorize it all at once. It's something that you really should be able to apply throughout your life. So I hope that you'll think of it in that vein. Um, so today, what we're going to do, we're going to talk about the next chapter, which is on political philosophy, and it's really an interesting chapter uh, because I told you it is. No, interesting. When I was an undergraduate at UCLA, and I was had to take this class. I think it was called Poli Sci 10 at the time, and I was like, I think I took it in summer session. I was like, oh man, I had to take this class. Political philosophers? Oh man, would I care about these guys from 200, 500, 1,000, 2,000 years ago, right? Um, and I didn't really even get it then. I did okay in the class and got through it, but I was like, oh man. But in my younger days, I really didn't grasp the importance of what these guys had to say, But here's the thing I've learned since then, obviously, throughout my career, and why I think it's so valuable uh, for a couple of reasons. And this chapter really is the essence of that. It really has to do with human nature. And when we talk about that in the realm of politics and political science, and I've told you before, politics is basically everything about your life because the essence of politics is power. And power is the ability to influence, and being able to influence your behavior, how you think, or what you do is the essence of that, and allows for all the decisions that you allow our leaders to make are based on what you perceive about the world around you, whether true or not, right? That's why we talked about manipulation being one of those types of power that people use to sort of manipulate the people to do what they want or vote for what they think is important. Um, but here's the thing. One thing you have to recognize when you look at these guys, right, throughout history, and I think it's an important component because people will often criticize, like for example, what Aristotle said, 2,500 years ago, that monarchy was the best type of government or best type of rule, as he called it. Or getting to Machiavelli, where he says that better for a leader to be feared than loved. Or looking at Thomas Hobbes, and Hobbes is saying basically human beings are selfish and greed motivated and need strong institutions of control to keep them in line. Uh, and to the more altruistic, guys like John Locke, and being able to sort of look at human beings through a more uh, uh, empathetic or sympathetic eye. And the thing that you have to recognize about any of these guys, including like guys like Karl Marx in the 19th century, who, basically people blame him for a lot of stuff, even though he's just a guy who was kind of a cranky old guy, but basically just had a theory about what would happen when people got tired of being exploited economically and socially. And so it's interesting how people will blame or misunderstand the context of the individual who's saying what they're saying. And ironically, it's interesting also, just because you agree with with the interpretation of any of these people, doesn't make you, like, for example, you could agree with something that Karl Marx says, but it doesn't mean you're a Marxist. It just means that you agree with some of the ideas he had about how the world works. People tend to get sort of one-dimensional and sort of limited in their thinking when they start to go down all these other rabbit holes, I call them. But the other part of this that I think is really important for all of you is that to recognize that whatever you read, to recognize these guys were writing at a snapshot in time, the time they were growing up in. So their socialization process was built around the time that they are growing up. So whatever's going on in the world or in their part of the world during that time is what they are looking at. The other thing I think is really critical about this is that when you recognize that, then you recognize they only have that lens plus the lens of history. So they can go back and read books about the things that happened before them to try to assess basically how human beings respond to power and manipulation and influence and force, and how it affects the world or has affected the world up to their time. Uh, and in essence, that's really the interesting part to me, about political philosophy, is that what it says about human nature, how human beings respond to power, Do human beings, for example, do human beings really, like the idea of having freedom? Do they like the idea of democracy and being able to be a part of the decision-making process? Or are they really more geared toward comfortably authoritarian rule? Many people really have often decided to give their power away to the leaders and let them run everything. Well, that's antithetical or a very opposite of democracy. Democracy requires our participation, and if we don't participate, you might as well put a crown on the guy's head and call him a king. Aristotle would have said that's not a bad idea, by the way. He would have said, you know what? If you have a really good person who's the king, then great. And that's actually very true because the king can get stuff done. He doesn't need a bureaucracy or anything like that to sort of go back and ask permission to do things. The king typically, or even the queen, had her money and power, so she could get things done without having to go and ask somebody for favors. So on one hand, you could say it's really handy because it's like one-stop shopping. On the other hand, if you get a bad person in there, then you got a bigger problem, right? Because now you got to deal with the reality of what happens when you have somebody crazy in there. What happens if you have a Nero or Caligula or somebody or Peter the Great or some other, or some other person who might not be quite as amenable to the things that people hold dear regarding human rights and just taking care of people naturally. If you don't have those kinds of people, then you've got a problem. And then the people have a problem. If you look at going back to the early 20th century, Germany was a democracy. And then, democracy, people got lazy and apathetic. And then all of a sudden, democracy collapses. And then what it leads to, and this is very typical of what happens with up and coming democracies or young democracies, is it fell back into authoritarianism. In comes this guy named Hitler. Hitler is all charismatic and he's all passionate, especially after World War II. Germany's broke and struggling and trying to find its identity. And he comes up with the whole Aryan race thing and all this stuff. And guess what? People start liking that because that's what they look at and go, hey, wow, I feel better about myself. But look at the consequences of it. Look at the consequences to the Jews. Look at the consequences to the world. How many people died in World War II, and those types of things. So um, while democracy in and of itself may not be the best thing in the world, there are certainly it could be the best of the worst, um, or the worst of the best, depending on how you look at it. So those are the things we're going to be looking at. So I'm going to jump into a little bit of the PowerPoints and show you a couple things, and then we'll continue on. So let me switch into the mode and let you see where we're headed. Okay, here we go. Now that we're into the PowerPoints, and again, I'm not going through all of them. You have access to them and you can go through all the details. I really want to cover some of the more specific aspects of this relevant to this conversation. And so let me jump into this, and I'm going to skip ahead to a couple of the slides that I think are relevant to the conversation. Um, so when, for example, when we go back and we look at some of the sort of context of understanding, how people came to form their ideas about politics and, political philosophy. And it really is interesting to note, the question of why, what are they looking at? What is the essence of what they're looking at? And you can see here from this one is based on Ambrose Bierce, who's basically saying that, he's sort of on the cynical side of things that basically says we cannot avoid questions of truth or falsity, good or bad. And then, one of the commentaries regarding that was that he's partly wrong because politics is also a contest of moral principles. And that is in some way the essence of the balance between what is morally right to do versus the ability to allow your country to survive. And so many people would say sometimes you got to swim in the swamp in order to get things done. So no matter how moral you may be as a human being, when you delve into politics, it's not always about morality. It's about trying to figure out how to keep your system afloat, along with trying to have some sense of social justice and reasonable amount of faith in your system. Say, in the context of political philosophy, that that it can be defined as you can see here, as a physical reflection on how best to arrange our collective lives. And this is really partially true because really what it reflects is, again, at the snapshot in which these philosophers are writing, it really is about looking at all the various aspects of life, from the structures of government, meaning our political institutions within the government, how it's organized to be able to provide goods and services to the general public, our social practices within our societies, and this could be religion, culture, even music and different aspects, all part of the social fabric of society. And then also the economic systems that they use to survive, which pays for goods and services. Uh, those are all part of life, and how these things are sort of reflected on helps build a base for what political philosophy is. That we focus on, and when we sort of analyze from the from the philosophical pretext, is there are things like you see here. So, and I'll just go through them quickly. So, the idea of human conflict, the pursuit of power, the best social arrangements, who should govern, the moral aspects of society, meaning dealing with things like equality, liberty, justice, human rights, etc. And then the state, the purpose of the state, what kinds of limits should be put on the state to do what it does, right? So, we talk about the pursuit of power, and many people would say, that this is where people get corrupted, that when people are pursuing power, which again is the ability to influence or control other people, it gets to be kind of like a drug, right? That even good people eventually get seduced and will compromise themselves because they're pursuing what they might perceive as the higher good, even though sometimes it may not be the higher good for all people, which is what Aristotle does when he breaks down the different types of rule, positive and negative types of rule. And then human conflict, this is one of the things that many philosophers sort of, delve into, that they look at and kind of go, well, this is really, the reality of human beings, that human beings basically are kind of warlike, competitive, and driven by, wanting to have more than the other person. It's what we call, sometimes we call it in political terms, a zero-sum game. And basically, with zero-sum game, it means that if I win, you have to lose. There isn't like a win-win scenario. And so, recognizing that that is in fact the case, which some philosophers believe, because of the time they grew up in, they might have grown up in a time when human conflict was at its pinnacle. And then because of that, they're like, this is the way existence really is. But it doesn't have to necessarily be that way. In fact, I would argue that perhaps it's not that way. That in fact, what we see frequently is that it depends on what time you're born in, and how people see the world in the lens of the time that you were born in. And that is much more indicative of your view of the world. If you grew up in a utopian society, then your notion of that didn't see war, your ideas of human conflict might be different. But you could also argue that in our human nature, are we naturally human beings that are built around the ideas of conflict? And there may be some truth to that, but it doesn't mean it has to be a societal thing, or how we control our urge to have conflict with one another or against other groups of people. Um, and then the social arrangements have to do with society at large, have to do with how we as a society sort of address, the fabric of our own, inside of our own bubble, how we address one another, how we deal with the rights of individuals within society, for example. The social constructs of any society that allow it to function. And then the question, of course, who should govern is tied basically to the pursuit of power. Democracy is really a government by the people, even though you rarely see it, because if that were the case, then the outgrowth of that would be laws and policies that serve the people. And what we see more and more today, at least in America, is the separation of power, and separation of connection between the government and the people. Otherwise, the world, I think, in terms of laws and policies, we would see different things that would be serving the interests of the people and not serving the country, or serving individuals within the country. Uh, and then again, the question of morality, and the question of doing what's right, for the right thing, whether we see it through our lens or not. And this is why I typically tell my students that it's not just about you. It's about the people around you as well. And that when everyone benefits, you also have the benefit of reaping some of the benefit as well. But if you're just walking around thinking, well, I want this and I think the world should be this way, well, it may be good for you in your little bubble. But, many people would say, and many philosophers would have said, that your freedom begins and ends at the tip of your nose. And then once you start to impede on other people and what they believe, then you're impinging on their freedom. And the question is, do you have a right to do that? And there's lots of complicated issues built around this framework that we struggle with every day. Whether it be the issue, the abortion or right to life, or freedom of choice, whether it be with the essence of, issues dealing with, racism or sexism or fear of people who don't think the way we think. Do we have a right to impinge on their ability to be free and have opportunities in society? How, what is our essence of our nature regarding human rights? Do we believe that other people have a right to exist? And how do we, it's amazing. I do a significant chapter in my regular classes on civil rights and civil liberties. And it's amazing when you look at, even in American history, the ugliness of things that have happened and still continue to happen in our society as we struggle with allowing people who don't see through the same lens to exist and to have try to allow them to have freedom. And in many ways, we're still fighting a civil war that ended over 150 years ago that we still struggle with, trying to allow people to be inclusive and what that really looks like, and why, in some ways, we allow ourselves to be manipulated to pit ourselves against one another. And why is that in fact the case? How, and one thing I used to tell my students, I say, when you take little kids at, 5 years old and you look at them and they're all playing together, they don't see gender, they don't see color, they don't see anything. They may fight about stuff, but it's not about stuff like that. Doesn't mean they don't have conflict, but it just means that they don't have conflict based on things that determine or define their ability to have freedom or exist within that group. And yet, in a matter of 10 years or maybe slightly more, we can teach them to hate one another, to hurt one another, to dehumanize each other. And to think about that and what that really says about us, not about them, the people who are in struggle, but what it says about those who would actually take that step to dehumanize or deny them their right to exist or their human rights within society. So I think there's a reflection there that we have to pay, homage to about those things. And then the last thing, of course, is the state of nature and the purpose of the state of nature. Like, how do we exist? What does the state of nature look like to us? Uh, is it one that's altruistic? Where everybody, like John Locke said, everybody's entitled to life, liberty, and property, or is it one that, in fact, says that I need to control everything and I know what's right, so therefore I will dictate to you what's right? These are some of the things that I think are the essence of this chapter that I think you'll find interesting and things I would like you to think about within your own self. How do you see those things? And then also, how do you think your family or the people you see those things? We can also, by our own education, educate our families as well. And that's a big important step in this, is that we can help educate others who may not see the lens through the way we see the lens. And that's a challenge and responsibility that we all have to try to be a little better. And hopefully, by benefiting from the knowledge that we gain from the people in history, we'll be able to do that. So I hope you enjoy going through the rest of the slides and watching the video clips and getting into some of the discussion about this, because I really want to know what you think. And there's no right or wrong in this. It's really about learning to expand yourself and expand your ideas about how you see the world around you. So have some fun with it, and I'll see you in the next week.